Well, here we go again. One of the most controversial pistols of all time is wrapped up in a new controversy, but this time it involves the military version of the P320, the M18 or M17, and today we're going to look at exactly what happened in this new unintentional discharge case. We're going to talk about things that have happened up to this point, but I really want to focus on, why Sig just kind of seemingly refuses to acknowledge issues with this gun. I think there's a couple of very important reasons that I'm going to give you my opinion on, and I really want to hear from y'all, man. Have y'all stuck by the P320? Have you stayed away from it from the very first incident? Or have you said, I'm never carrying one of those because I don't trust them? Whatever your opinion might be, leave that down below. Let's go ahead and jump right in. I don't know exactly where I fell in line with reviewing the P320, but I know I had at least one of the first videos out there. It was actually the center of a discussion that continued this channel, because I started back in 2014, and early 2015 is when I bought my first P320. I actually still have it. And since then, I've used several of these variants, and I've always liked the P320. They're super smooth when it comes to a gun that points supernaturally, that shoots really good. All of the different variants that have come out since 2014, it is one of those guns that I feel like a lot of people can utilize and shoot really well. Light, crisp trigger. One of the cool things when these first came out was the fact that you could, swap the chassis. So the chassis was the serialized part, not the frame. So if you want to change to a little smaller frame or larger frame or whatever, super modular design. So all of that has been really well. And then of course in 2017 is when they secured the military contract. But that's also the year when they had the drop testing issue. I think it was Dallas PD that originally halted use of the P320 when they found that at a certain degree, like 33 degrees, when the pistol would be dropped, it would actually unintentionally fire. Now, I did a video, this was probably a couple years ago, if I had to take a guess off the top of my head, where I tried to take one of my P320s and I actually tried to get it to discharge, but on a snap cap, right? So I didn't do any kind of live firing or anything like that because, Sig did the voluntary upgrade. So essentially what happened was the triggers used to be much bigger, much heavier than what they are now. So they found that there was enough inertia in the trigger that it could actually move itself back to the rear and fire. So this was actually confirmed, and they did some changes on the inside. They added a mechanical disconnector. They added another sear face. They did some internal changes. I never sent mine back because I never had any issues with it, but I also never carried the gun. So I always trusted them, but then again, I never carried one on my hip. I always thought, they're a little bit too big, too cumbersome. I don't carry outside the waistband like that or open carry or anything. So I never had a real reason to do that. Even though it was a bedside gun for a while, it mainly sat in the safe, even the safe on the side of my bed. So I never really had to worry about it. But it was interesting that that was a voluntary recall because it's almost like Sig acknowledged there's issues, but they never did a mandatory. So I guess that's kind of where some of the protective nature that Sig has continued to be very touchy almost in a way when it comes to the P320. And I gotta be honest with you, man, when I went up to Sig Sauer last year, they were very upfront with the P320 and the testing that it went through. They said that people would come in from the military on any given notice. They would go through a batch of how many ever pistols, and they would test those things, not only testing for safety, but also for accuracy. Like accuracy, the Beretta never was subjected to. And maybe that's part of what's going on here. I'll expand on that here in a minute. Now, since 2017, we've had over, like 100 incidences where P320s have unintentionally went off. Now, some of these videos, in my opinion, it was obviously the officer that had an issue with that gun or the shooter himself. But there's been others that have been a little less obvious. There's one I can think about right off the top of my head where the gun goes off in the guy's holster and he literally just bent down and did something and the gun went off on him. And so over all of these incidences, I think there's 2 that Sig has lost so far out of all these lawsuits. They have like 18, I think, that they've won. I might be a little off on my numbers, but I know there's 2 that plaintiffs have won. One was worth like $2.5 $5 million. Then there was another multi-million-dollar one in Pennsylvania. But the vast majority of these cases, Sig Sauer's won, and they have said that it was due to human error, holstering issues, whatever that might be. It wasn't because of the gun being unsafe. Now, fast forward to July of this year. F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, Airman First Class Braden Levon actually ended up losing his life because of an unintentional discharge. Now, as of the making of this video, we don't know the details. All we know is that he unfortunately lost his life, and the Air Force Global Strike Command, led by General Thomas Bussiere, hopefully I said that correctly, halted all use of the P320 or the M18, and they actually reissued M4s in order to keep the Air Force Base secure. Now, the M18 and the M17 are a little bit different, not that much different, but they're a little bit different in that they have external safeties. This was actually a requirement from the United States military whenever they adopted this gun. So you have an ambidextrous safety on the side right here. Now, I'm not sure what happened. It's going to be really interesting to see some of the details that come out from this, because did he have his safety engaged? Did he not? Like I said, this is the first time we've actually seen an issue with this gun. When it comes to the regular P320, there's variants with safeties, there's variants without them. I think the vast majority do not have external safeties, they have internal safeties. But when you look at the design of the gun, one thing stands out compared to the vast majority of handguns on the market, and that is the fact that they do not use a trigger safety in the middle of the trigger. The same safe action system that Glock perfected, pretty much every company now uses those, from Smith & Wesson to FN, Canik, Walther. I mean, they almost all use them, because on a striker fire gun, essentially you have the striker on this one is pre-cocked. So some companies will actually have you, when you pull the trigger, finish the cocking of the striker, and then that striker is released once it gets to a certain point. Well, in the P320, the reason the triggers are so good, and one of the reasons they shoot really well too, is the fact that the striker is already pre-cocked. So all you're doing is basically releasing that striker whenever you pull the trigger back. And so my thing was always, why not just add a trigger safety on there? It almost 100% assures that you are not going to have any kind of unintentional discharges. Because remember, there's been holster issues that Sig has talked about. And I think some of these have actually been confirmed. That something gets inside of the trigger, some kind of foreign object from the holster, maybe the type of holster, right? This has kind of been an ongoing thing with Sig Sauer as well. But if you add a trigger shoe, this would, in my opinion, eliminate probably the vast majority of these issues. There's a reason that most companies that are making striker fire guns actually utilize that trigger safety. Even Smith & Wesson, before they went to a traditional or flat blade type of trigger safety, they had the hinge design. So the trigger has to be pulled a certain way in order to fire. So if some object gets in your holster, right, in between the time you draw the gun to the time you reholster, even if it pulls the trigger from the side, you're still not going to get any kind of boom, because it's got to be pulled in the middle. That trigger shoe has to basically be lined up, be pulled inside the trigger itself in order to fire. Sig has not done that. You know, the other thing I noticed with this gun too, it's kind of interesting, is you hear that? That's basically the looseness of the trigger. Now I want to show you something up close here, just how little pressure it takes to actually set this gun off. And by the way, I'm not saying that looseness confirms or denies that these pistols are unsafe. I'm just saying it's interesting because when I look at other guns, you have a little bit of movement in the trigger, but certainly you don't have this side-to-side type of movement, which might be a little concerning. I don't know. I just think it's interesting. But if you look at the trigger, we get it to the wall, pull start. One thing you'll notice is how little you really have to pull the trigger in order to get the gun to go off. Now, it has a decent amount of weight, I think. And like I said, I've never had an issue with them, but that could be one thing that they could do to probably alleviate a lot of this. Because regardless of holsters being used and all this kind of stuff, not saying that some of these incidences don't happen with other manufacturers, but man, they've either blown up a heck of a lot less and they just get a heck of a lot less coverage, or there is an inherent issue with the P320 that Sig Sauer needs to address. And look, the spotlight has been on these guys since basically 2017, when that first drop testing issue came about. So why is Sig so adamant that the P320 cannot fire itself? I think one of the clearer things to people is the fact that, they've had a unanimous jury side with them and say, hey, this pistol is not defective. They've won or had most of the cases thrown out that have been brought against them. There have been videos that have shown police officers and shooters making mistakes with the gun, so it's not the gun itself, at least in Sig's eyes. But I'll be honest with you, one of the things that I kind of alluded to in the beginning and why I think they are so adamant with this gun and standing by it almost seemingly no matter what happens is because of that military contract. I think if they were to add a trigger shoe to this gun, that would be admitting fault. And I believe they think that maybe the military would then drop them, or they would open themselves up to a heck of a lot more lawsuits. And here's the thing, if there was a change made motivated by safety concerns, it could be seen as a subsequent remedial measure that wouldn't necessarily prove Sig was at fault under Rule 407 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. But attorneys for pending lawsuits could say, hey, Sig knew there was an issue, they didn't act quick enough, and they could say that Sig misled customers into thinking this pistol is actually safe when it's not. Remember, there's still 80 plus lawsuits pending against Sig. This, I believe, is one of the biggest reasons they are not making changes. This could explain why they, even going all the way back, they did voluntary upgrades. Remember, they just got that contract in 2017, and we seen drop testing issues as early as 2017. The military, if Sig were to do design changes that didn't meet the initial specs of the military back then, think about this. Well, they come out with a newer design. Now, you got to reprove the pistol. You got to go through all of the R&D, millions and millions of dollars. And if you think there isn't a part of this that doesn't come down to money, you're sadly mistaken. Because anything with the military, anything at all in this world, the money is involved somewhere. And think about the companies that went after that military contract. You had, of course, Beretta that tried to retain the contract, Glock, maybe a couple others, whatever. Those companies could easily come after Sig and say, hey, their pistol wasn't safe, ours is. They could try to undercut them. Since there's an idea of how much the military paid for these contracts, of course it would make whatever company, if they were to reinitiate this, it would make them into the next big thing, to be totally honest with you. And a lot of what Sig Sauer does now revolves around their military contract. Deny and defend might be the most plausible thing for Sig to do, especially when it comes to the financial part of it. I'm not saying that every single Sig Sauer P320, M18, or M17 is flawed, but there is something in the design that they have to address. They make some of the best guns, period. And I still stand by that. But there's something inherently wrong with this design that they just need to come out and say it. And I don't know, maybe they're just too far in now with the deny and defend position they've taken. There's a lot on the line here, but you also have people's lives on the lines, not just people in the military now. Think about how many service members and the things they have to worry about in their everyday lives. The last thing they should be worried about, people in the military and regular shooters, regular citizens exercising their rights that buy your product, the last thing they should be worried about is their own gun being used against them. There have been cases where this thing has been mishandled by the user, for sure. But I believe, now more than ever, to be honest with you, is that there's some inherent flaw here that Sig needs to address before this gets really out of hand. That's just my opinion, though. I'd love to hear yours. Let me know if you've had any issues with the P320 yourself. Let me know why you think Sig has kind of refused to make some of these changes. Maybe there's something else that I'm not even thinking about. Leave that down below if you like what I do. Consider subscribing. See you in the next one. And as always, hold them down.